Hello and welcome to Intro to the Carbohydrates. This is Instructor Parrish. In this short video, we're going to discuss the composition and chemical structure of carbohydrates. We're going to differentiate between the different types of carbohydrates, discuss where they can be found in the diet, and then also their functions within the body. To start off, let's discuss what we already have learned about carbohydrates. We know that carbohydrates are a macronutrient, meaning we need carbohydrates in larger quantities from the diet. We also know that carbohydrates are an energy yielding nutrient because they provide energy as we measure in calories. So carbohydrates provide 4 calories per gram. They are also an organic nutrient because they contain carbon, and we often abbreviate carbohydrates as CHO as they contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Now let's take a look at what makes up carbohydrates. First, let's look at the term carbohydrate. Carbo, which is the first part of the term carbohydrate, stands for carbon, and hydrate stands for water. So as you can see, carbohydrates are made up of a mixture of carbon and water. Carbohydrates are actually made up of carbon and water in a 2-to-1 ratio. So we often abbreviate the simplest form of carbohydrates, which is a monosaccharide or a sugar, as C6H12O6, containing 6 carbon atoms, 12 hydrogen atoms, and 6 oxygen atoms. Okay, this will be important as we start looking at the structure of each of the types of carbohydrates. Now let's take a look at the difference between a simple versus a complex carbohydrate. You'll often hear carbohydrates referred to as either a simple or a complex carbohydrate in literature or in common terms. Simple and complex carbohydrates are simply energy for plants and animals. Simple carbohydrates are our sugars, and there's 2 types of simple carbohydrates or sugars that we're going to discuss, and that's monosaccharides and disaccharides. And then the complex carbohydrates, complex just meaning many sugars, are starch, fiber, and then glycogen. Okay? Let's start off by discussing the monosaccharides. Monosaccharides are just single sugar molecules. It's easy to remember because saccharide means sugar and mono means one. So 1 sugar molecules. Okay? All of our monosaccharides contain 6 carbon, 12 oxygen, and 6 hydrogen atoms. Although they all contain the same type and number of atoms, the arrangement of the atoms are different. And due to the different arrangement, we end up having different degrees of sweetness from each of the monosaccharides, and each of the monosaccharides are additionally used differently within the body. Now the primary monosaccharide is glucose. Glucose makes up all of the disaccharides and all of the polysaccharides in combination with these other 2 monosaccharides. Glucose is our primary sugar that is used for energy within the body. Okay, so when you hear about blood glucose, this is what we're talking about. Sometimes glucose can also be referred to as dextrose when we talk about blood glucose. So blood glucose and dextrose would be the same thing. Okay? All right, and then next there is galactose. Galactose is typically not found as a single unit or a single sugar in the diet, but it does make up the disaccharide lactose that we'll talk about later on. And then fructose is our last monosaccharide, and fructose is our fruit sugar. It's commonly found in fruits and also honey. And you've probably also heard of high fructose corn syrup. This is a modified fructose that manufacturers use to sweeten products. And there's been a lot of hype about high fructose corn syrup not being healthy and some health effects surrounding the consumption of high fructose corn syrup that you will learn about by either reading in the textbook or in class. All right, and then lastly I want to point out, here are the chemical structures of glucose, galactose, and fructose. You can see that they're all ring structures, and really the difference between these is how the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms are arranged. and again. The arrangement of the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms influences the sweetness of each of these monosaccharides and their functions and utilization within the body. All right, now let's talk about the disaccharides. Disaccharides are just two monosaccharides that have been linked together. So you can remember this very easily. Di meaning two and saccharides meaning sugars. Two sugars. The three disaccharides found in our diet are maltose, sucrose, and lactose. Maltose is simply made up of two glucose atoms, and maltose typically isn't found in too high of amounts in the diet. It can be found in barley and also when we ferment grains to make alcohol, but it is more commonly found as we start digesting some of the more complex carbohydrates within the GI tract. All right, and next is sucrose. Sucrose is simply a glucose and fructose molecule linked together. And sucrose makes up table sugar, so that white sugar that you would use for baking or that you would put in your coffee, that's sucrose. And then also sucrose is found to naturally sweeten fruits and vegetables and some grains. Okay? And then lactose is our milk sugar. So this is the sugar that is found in our dairy products. And lactose is made up of glucose and galactose. Now, how do we make a disaccharide? A disaccharide is made through a condensation reaction. There's two monosaccharides, and in order to link these monosaccharides together, we remove a hydroxyl group, or a hydroxyl group is simply an oxygen and a hydrogen bonded together. We remove a hydroxyl group from one monosaccharide and a hydrogen atom from another monosaccharide. By doing this, we're able to link two monosaccharides together by a bonded oxygen atom. Okay, so we take two individual monosaccharides and link them together to make one disaccharide. And this commonly happens in plants as plants are making disaccharides and they're making polysaccharides to store energy. Okay? All right, now let's move on and take a look at our complex carbohydrates. Complex carbohydrates are called polysaccharides. Poly meaning many and saccharide meaning sugars. Now there are three types of polysaccharides. There's glycogen, there's starch, and then there's fiber. Okay, right here is a specific type of fiber called amylose. Let's first take a look at starch. Starch is made up of many glucose molecules linked together. Now starch is interesting in that the glucose molecules are linked together through condensation reactions which occur in plants, and the glucose molecules are packed very tightly together. So the glucose molecules are linked together in a linear fashion and stacked on top of each other so that you can fit many glucose molecules in a very tight space. Starch can be found in grains, starchy vegetables like potatoes, peas, and corn. Also, beans and different legumes also contain significant amounts of starch. Starch provides energy in the form of carbohydrates because starch is a type of carbohydrate. And starch is digested in the GI tract, and then eventually, because starch is a polysaccharide, all of the monosaccharides that make up starch will be broken apart and will be absorbed individually. So starch, because it is a polysaccharide and made of many monosaccharides, it will take longer to digest within the GI tract, and we'll talk about that in a different video. Next is dietary fiber, which is also a polysaccharide. Dietary fiber is found in plants, but it doesn't provide energy to the body as starch provides energy to the body. Instead, dietary fiber makes up the structural components of plants. There's actually two types of dietary fiber. There's soluble and there is insoluble dietary fiber. Soluble fiber is easily digested by the bacteria in the colon and can be used as an energy source by the bacteria in the colon. And good sources of soluble fiber would be things like oats, like Cheerios or oatmeal, barley, legumes, some citrus fruits. And then insoluble fiber cannot be digested by the bacteria in the colon, and you really want to think of insoluble fiber as like the sticks and the twigs. Good sources of insoluble fiber would include things like whole grains, brown rice, some fruits, beans, and cruciferous vegetables like cabbage, broccoli, and cauliflower. Now in the textbook, there's a much more comprehensive list of food sources of both soluble and insoluble fiber. And later on, you're going to learn about the functions and health benefits of soluble versus insoluble fiber. What's important to know is that our GI tract is not able to digest soluble and insoluble fiber. In other words, the enzymes that are present and responsible for digestion within the GI tract are not able to recognize the bonds that link the monosaccharides together that make up dietary fiber. As you can see here, here are the bonds that link the monosaccharides together to make starch. And then here are the bonds that link the monosaccharides together that make up dietary fiber. The enzymes in our GI tract are only able to recognize the bonds that link the monosaccharides together that make up starch, and not those that make up dietary fiber. So for that reason, dietary fiber, although it is made up of monosaccharides, does not provide energy because it is not able to be digested within our GI tract. All right, moving on, let's discuss glycogen. Glycogen is the storage form of glucose in the body, and we store glycogen in the liver and also in our muscles. Glycogen is not a significant source of carbohydrates in the diet. Now, although glycogen can be found in the muscles, it's not found in a large amount. So glycogen is not a significant source of carbohydrates in our diet. The carbohydrates in our diet will come from monosaccharides and disaccharides and starch, and then also dietary fiber. Now, what's really interesting about glycogen is the structure. Glycogen is actually branched chains of glucose molecules. The branch structure is extremely important in that it allows many different points of hydrolysis, or many different areas where the glucose molecules can be broken apart in order to create a rapid release of glucose into the blood. So although we store glycogen in the liver, and glycogen is made up of glucose, when the body needs glucose, glycogen can be broken down into single glucose units that can be released into the blood, and the body can be used as energy. All right, that is the end of this video. I thank you for watching this video, and please feel free to contact your instructor with any questions.